conception about if you don't travel, you're not a traveller, which is the same thing as saying to somebody from Ireland, if you cannot speak Irish, you are not Irish.
Yes.
That is not the case. Only because you might be missing or have one factor, it doesn't constitute who you are as an identity. So a lot of settled people miss that. They assumed if we didn't travel, we're not travellers, and we're all failed settled people, and we didn't cut it, and we're kicked out during the famine. And there's slight elements towards the famine part of it, but failed we've never felt in our lives.
Yeah.
And I think we paid a heavy price for that, because we die much younger than the settled community. We lived in the ways that we live, we are forced to live in some of the worst conditions that you wouldn't be able to sell this land. I've often wondered how the hell they even sold it in the first place, because they put it beside power plants, they put it beside railway tracks, they put it in swamps, they put it way outside of the settled community. Almost they were ashamed of us, whatever it was, and I could never truly understood why it got to that extreme to do that to the people.
Yeah.
But the more I learn from people like you, which I've never learned from any other historian, so I'm pitting you against all them other historians now, just to let you know that. They might come looking for you.
Yeah.
But they seem to me to be very, 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 very nice and pleasant almost to the British. It's almost like, okay, they were here, they did bad things, but at least they left behind their language and their systems, and now we're all used to it. Let's get on, everybody.
Yeah. So there's exactly. So there's you got the British, and when I mentioned the British, we have to call a spade a spade. We have to talk about what things come from. It's not to get at them as such. Do you know what I mean? But it's that's a different day's work. They came and went, and as you describe, independence didn't solve these problems in Ireland. Like so-called independence came along, or to some extent came along, but the systems that were put in place during the empire that were created to change people's language. Like at that time, you went into the school, was there a thing called a stick or a tally thing or something they used to give kids, that if every time they spoke Irish it was marked or whatever. I can't remember the story, but people were the policy was to change people's culture, and had been since the late 16th century.
Oh yeah, that's the dirty now, the 1600s or 1700s.
Since Spencer.
There was something on television a while back, I think it was John Connor and Sidney Joyce and a few, Michael McDonough, brilliant people. It was Blood of the Tramplers. And they were talking, it wasn't an historian as such, but he seemed to think he knew his history anyway. But he was part of the historical DNA tracking and this kind of stuff. And he was saying there was a divergence at some point, I think it was the 1700s, where travellers broke away from settled people. But that doesn't make sense to us.
No, so that doesn't make sense in historical terms either, because what people now call a settled community is not what Ireland was like then, if you know what I mean. There's this imagination, a fond imagination amongst
people would say
what we now call a settled community.
Yeah, but people would say then the people evolved, they changed with the times, but that's not necessarily true either in Ireland.
No, well, they got a date for. Let's talk about genetics. They got a date for divergence. They looked for a time when certain genes may have, where there's a difference in the genetic signature between. I'm not quite sure how it works entirely, but drift between the genetic signature of what they're picking up with travellers and then the general settled Irish. They know that.
Well, just hold that, because just for the listeners' purposes, right? Our purpose is that when people hear that, the next assumption is to say that travellers through intermarriage would have made that genetic difference, right? Now that may well be a certain truth to that, but you must also take into context that's a long bloodline. That was very similar when you were speaking before about even the tribes and the little kind of territories they had.
Yes.
Different tribes were marrying into each other. Not the tribes, but inner tribes. And time to time, outer tribes would, depending how they got on.
Yeah, well, in any system that involves clans, your name means everything, in the sense that you're descended from. It's nearly always some king of some sort.
So the gene pool was always usually within.
Well, that's what gave you your status, to some extent. Not entirely, but well, because of the law, I said there was a law that if you're. Within 4 generations, if a person was say at the top end of society, if a person was a king or a chief of an area, the next 4 generations after him were eligible to be elected as a king as well. But after those 4 generations, you lost that status if nobody got there, if you know what I mean.
gotcha.
So that's how you went down the way, if you know what I mean. But so therefore, like, there'd be in each generation after the person who was king, each of the next generations would be fairly keen to get someone in there at some point. And in some cases it might alternate. Another family might get the king. A king was elected, if you know what I mean, from amongst a lot of the clans. So it's kind of a mixed system. It's partially aristocratic in the sense that families at the top tended to be descended, but it's not from father to son. It goes, a chief is elected by the heir people in that too, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, that's an example of what we're talking about. Like, but it would mean then that when someone is a king, say like Connor becomes king, or, you know, whatever, everybody after that, then the Mac Connors or the O'Connors or whatever, are following from that guy. They're saying, well, we're descendants of this very important guy.
Gotcha.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
therefore we're all eligible also to be kings, you know what I mean, or chiefs, or whatever it is, trade, or whatever trade you're following, you know.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
See, you know, I've almost, I won't say self-identified because I'm not a scientist, so therefore the theory I'm given about intermarriages in the bloodline makes perfect sense in a historical context. But also, if we can identify that as that, then we'll have to also ask about why is the settled community's genetics different?
Yeah.
Why is it not the same?
Yeah, well, they can see that they're same origin.
Same origin.
So they can see they're similar or same origin to some. You know, they can see that. They were picking up two things as far as I know. They could see that there was as you say, a bloodline or separation going back about 1,000 years, and they were also picking up a divergence, which is the important thing you were saying, between the regular settled community, as they call it, the majority at the moment, and the travelling community. That divergence is going back about 400 years, and it goes back perfectly to the time of the 17th century, what we call Elizabethan conquest or reconquest of Ireland. Some of them call it. Conquest would be the best one because it wasn't really fully conquered before that. So that time is the biggest dislocation in Irish society, when the old Gaelic system is destroyed, basically destroyed. And the entire country is put into turmoil, especially around the time of Cromwell. And there's a lot of dispersion of people, transportation of people overseas. A lot of the population dies, basically. But that divergence at that time is framed, as you say, it was framed because it has been framed as that the travellers separate from the settled community. Now, there's an assumption there that the settled community has always been a settled community in the way that we see it now.
When it's said like that the travellers broke away or diverged away from the settled community, there's the assumption, as you said, that that's the way it was all along. Yeah,
so there's a problem with that because the Irish settled community, as we know it, living in little stone houses or brick houses as we see them now, it's not true that we didn't always live like that. So that's not the case, you know what I mean? In the case that all Irish people at some point lived in a clan system, they had to. And therefore, when they say that there's this divergence, it doesn't make sense the way around they have it. So if I was to interpret that same genetic evidence, I would say that we have to reverse it and say that the divergence is the settled from a people living in a clan system, which automatically would have genetics, would be certain to some extent restricted. We'd expect them restricted within certain areas, say like within provinces, for example. You know what I mean? Like Munster, Connacht, whatever. We'd expect those families had been intermarrying for a long time. You know.
Well, but to put forward a plausible suggestion, let's assume that before that divergence, everybody was travellers. Just assume that.
Yeah, in a way, that's what. In a kind of a way, that's kind of what we're saying. Not everyone. Yeah, everyone's in clan system, but then again. Yeah, so, but obviously, like any society, as you go nearer the bottom of the society, as it were, that breaks down to some extent. You know what I mean? And you got people who are you know what I mean, more intermingled. You got people who were not, like I described earlier, people who in Irish society would have been outside that. You know, like refugees, exiles, criminals. You know what I mean? Things like this. You know, all kinds of people, like poor people in general, people with disabilities, like that kind of thing. You know what I mean? In those days, as well as just clans that are down under luck to some extent, or lost their head man, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Had a bad week in the battlefield.
Well, these things happened, and people fell out of the, like, even nowadays, you know, people certain fall out of the bottom of society. But the stronger your clan, the better you off you were, because Irish society relied, your status came from your family and from your clan and your level in general. You know what I mean? It wasn't an individualist society as we have now, or what we're used to now.
Well, another way of putting it forward, or maybe another way of putting it is, rather than say the divergence had anything to do with geneticists, right? Would it be more something like psychological then? Well, the genetics is there.
So the genetics is showing. So the way we're saying it now, the genetics would be showing something more straightforward in a way. It's we understand that there was an invasion. We understand that invasion altered the face of the country to some extent, altered the society. Yeah. That's not in question. So it seems obvious to think that the biggest change happened to the people who are now most like the English society. So the ones that separated out of the clans and settled into stone houses, and you know what I mean, that they hadn't been living in before necessarily, and living in towns, for example. I would imagine that was not strategic movement or anything else. I think what could have happened there was the people that did come into the houses were actually what would you call them, maybe the outcast, lower caste type people, rejected for one reason or another. Could they be more subjectified to take that offer up than people who were headstrong and warrior type? Yes, so they did it on. Yeah, so you're right. Obviously, it's complicated, but you're right in the sense that you can actually read it in texts where the initial plan of the Elizabethan English state, which is actually the Dublin government extending control across the country, and part of their plan, as they say, is to separate the people from their lords, and to separate the people from their chiefs and from the warriors and other people like this that are obviously a problem to the state project. And they want to domesticate them. They want them to be taxpayers. They want them to live in one place. And they want
familiar.
them. Yeah. So to do that, though, they have to separate one from the other. So they're not too worried about what happens. These warriors and that, as long as they're out of their way. But what they do is draw their followers away from them first, if you know what I mean, by offering them maybe an incentive. You know what I mean? Like,
I'd say something that's quite well known. I know for facts because I've been involved with community development, so therefore I'd be privy to kind of news articles and information, community information, and sharing information.
Yeah. In
Ireland, even at this current moment, if two travellers or two traveller families end up before the courts, 9 out of 10, regardless of the incidents, 9 out of 10, they'll all walk out of court with a bound to the peace. But if the traveller family is up in court against a settled person, 9 out of 10 the travellers get in jail. So they were telling them telling us in a very nice way, we don't care if you kill each other, just don't do it near our community, our settled people, this kind of thing. So go off and kill each other if you want to. When we come here, we treat you different.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? In a way, it's interesting. I mean, I know it's serious, but it's interesting. Because it's sort of acknowledging, as you're saying, that you're outside the law, outside the jurisdiction, in a sense, of those courts. Yeah.
It's almost like they're saying to you, you're a bad influence on our British way of life. You're actually a constant bad reminder.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, to make it more, exactly. So we say British, but like since the Norman time in the 12th century, there had been an English. I'm calling it English. The culture in the towns in Dublin, for example, had been a sort of what we call an Anglo-Irish culture had developed in the Pale.
And you say Anglo-Irish. Where does Anglo come from?
From England. So you have the Pale. The area around Dublin would have been subject to English kings since about the 12th century. So
they call Dublin the Pale. Yeah,
so you have a Pale. The Pale is a fence around Dublin in the Middle Ages, if you know what I mean.
You're joking me. Like a wall.
Yeah, so literally a fence around.
Who paid for that?
Well, they were always giving out about it. They call it the Black Rent in Dublin.
Wow.
Where they used to the two Black Rent. The Black Rent was the rent there was protection money they used to pay to the Irish chiefs beyond the wall, right? Which is like something out of Game of Thrones, I understand. And there was another tax. There was a tax called smoke silver, would you believe?
Smoke silver?
Yeah. They were always giving out about this. There was a tax for defence of the Pale, right? and for the upkeep of the fence, the pale fence. The pale fence was the only thing protecting them from the wild.
The upkeep of the fence.
Yeah.
So
there was a ditch and a fence and gates. And
who was
what
the
have you.
workers? I wonder.
Well, good question.